Hi, good afternoon, good morning, good evening from wherever you're calling in. Welcome again to this webinar by Kingsfield Academy. This time we're covering the cost impacts on projects as a result of COVID-19. Let me just introduce the team today. So there's obviously myself, Carl Haynes. I'll just be moderating and dropping out most of the time and hopefully dropping in as and when just to ask a few questions and post up a few polls. Also joined with me, some of you may recognize if you've been in on these before, is Karen Cherrill from Kingsfield Academy. Also Chris Marsh, who is an associate of Kingsfield, and then in the background is Wayne Edmonds doing all the engineering for us as usual. So in a moment, I'm going to just hand over to Chris and perhaps give an introduction on himself. But just for those who haven't done one of these webinars with us before, just a quick outline of how we're going to run this. It's a 45-minute duration webinar. 35 minutes will be mostly with a conversation between Karen and Chris about the different subject areas under this topic we'll be covering. And then we're hoping to reserve 10 minutes at the end for questions. So please, as we're going through the webinar, if you have any questions, type them into your question box and they'll get fed through to me and we will deal with that at the end there. So let me come back to Chris. Chris, if I can just give you just a short period, just to introduce yourself, please tell us a bit about yourself. Thank you.
Okay, yep. Thanks, Carl. Good afternoon, everyone. As Carl said, my name is Chris Marsh. I have a background mainly in cost and estimating and various business management roles in the engineering construction. That's coming on for nearly 40 years now. And most recently, I've spent some time on major infrastructure projects here in the UK. I now work with Kingsfield in the development and delivery of courses and training involving cost and commercial issues.
There we go. Thank you, Chris.
Okay,
That's
great.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Chris. Great.
I was waiting
Thanks.
for the pause there, Carl.
I'm just aware that I'm just aware that my internet might be being a bit troublesome today, so I might well hand over to you, Karen, in a moment. But let's just start with the first poll of the day, I think. So Wayne, if you could just bring that first poll up for me, and let's get some feedback from you out there listening in on this. What we're interested in is, what is likely to have the biggest impact on engineering construction costs? What's your opinion on this? So we've given you 4 options here. There's the likelihood of a forthcoming recession, social distancing measures and the effect on productivity, skill shortages, and this might be through restricted labor movement or perhaps a change of methodology. And then finally, tightening of supply markets due to a decrease in competitors. So we'll just give a few moments for those results to come through. And as I said, as we're going through, if you have any questions for Karen, Chris, then please just put those into the question box and we will get back to those at the end. Okay, Wayne, so let's have a look and see what the responses are to that. Okay, so a kind of mixed response there, not so much on the tightening of the supply market, but social distancing seems to be at the fore, and then equally shared by skill shortages and the likelihood of a forthcoming recession. Okay, so I think that's probably enough from me at the moment. Let's get down to business, and I'm going to hand swiftly across to Karen and Chris for you to go on talking about the topic. So thank you, guys.
Okay, thanks, Carl. And I imagine it was probably quite difficult for people to choose one out of those 4 options, even though the social distancing was the top. I would imagine that there were 2 or 3 of those that you're all pretty worried about at the moment. So what we're going to do today is have a general conversation about the cost impacts and almost the economic aftershocks of this pandemic and its impacts. We're going to be thinking about the whole life cycle. So there'll obviously be a difference in impact depending on whether you're currently bidding or tendering for a project compared to if you've just about to sign your life away on a price that you may be a little bit worried about now, through to projects that you're currently delivering and maybe in early engineering or right the way through to in construction. So we're going to offer some general comments on these. Obviously, and if you have any specific questions, we'll take them at the end. So one thought before we start, which is something that Chris pointed out, which reminded me from my complexity studying, was the acronym that we could use to describe this current climate is something called VUCA, VUCA. And for those of you who don't know it, it stands for volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. And I think that hopefully describes exactly the situation that we're in at the moment. The really good way of thinking about that is it really informs the type of decision-making environment that we're in. How do you plan going forward in an environment like that? And how do you manage risk? And when we're looking at costs, planning and risk management is absolutely key, as I'm sure Chris will endorse. So what we're going to do first is just is we're going to have a quick discussion. I'm going to ask you, Chris, in terms of what's the big picture here, in terms of the overall effects on cost activities wherever we are in the life cycle.
Yeah, I think the big picture is obviously between the two issues that we have three main issues. We have had a number of sites which have had to shut down over the last few weeks, and looks like they're going to continue to be shut down until for the forthcoming time, obviously here in the UK and abroad as well. So the very first issue which we'll have is when these restart, we will have a baselining issue of looking at where the cost and the schedule is, and what our current progress was to date and where we are at the moment, and then rebaselining all that for the earned value calculations. I think from there we got the unknown situation, which is the economic issue. All the indicators and all the discussions that we have, we're talking about a possible forthcoming recession, which looks like it may be very deep. The one other thing we do know is that the social measures or the social distancing measures which have been put into place are going to cause an effect on productivity. But obviously that will depend upon what trades we're discussing. So for example, if you're a road building crew, which is mainly plant driven, you're automatically social distancing anyway. So I wouldn't expect a huge cost increase in certain major civils activities. But you then do have to wonder how a pipe rigging crew is going to do rig pipe work and rig valves while maintaining a 2 meter social distancing. So that may drive on to things like greater mechanical handling, greater prefabrication, or reduced number of activities on site by having smaller work gangs, but a longer schedule. Will you actually see the return of 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week working, but with a much lower number of resources on site? But obviously that would be a much pronounced schedule.
Yeah, and we don't know at the moment, so how long the social distancing measures in particular will stay in place. But at the moment, it seems like it's going to be a year to 18 months, isn't it, really, before those can move back to normal, whatever the normal is. Yeah.
Yes, and certainly, and of course, I would expect over the course of the next year for there to be a lot of talk about future preventative measures to make sure this doesn't happen again.
Yes,
I think this has been a wake-up call on a lot of issues as to how we may have to work in the future. You only have to look at the discussion which is now in the media of another number of companies are now talking about the future of big offices full of people is very limited. So you have to think about what does the future of big construction sites look like.
Yes, Yes.
are they going to be very limited by the number of people that work there?
Okay. Yeah. So did you want to, we discussed before some areas around resources, productivity, data and culture. Do you want to dive into those in a bit more detail and share your thoughts with us?
Yeah, because I mean, with any kind of cost thing, it's always driven by how productive you are in terms of what's the rate of progress you're making and what the resources are. We've talked about how social distancing is going to affect productivity, either both directly or indirectly. The increase in indirect costs through PPE or greater supervision or change in shift patterns. But we're also going to have a change in resources, because it's great to talk about changing to shift patterns and all that, but then that requires a different labor force to be employed on site. Might mean changes in design or methodologies in terms of how things are done. It may drive greater prefabrication. And I think the other big thing that we then need to look at from resources is what's the possible disruption in supply chain should a very big recession hit. Because we know from the economic crisis back in 2009 and the downturn of oil is that just because you have a downturn or recession does not necessarily lead to cheaper prices.
No.
Vendors and suppliers will then cut their production to suit the available market, but while maintaining a decent price. What we might see, though, is if the economic downturn is as great as what people are talking about, you might see a considerable impact on global supply. So the amount of vendors which are participating in the markets might be considerably lower. And therefore, just the pure way of getting materials to site might be considerably disrupted.
Okay.
And that's not to say that all of the lovely commercial issues which will come about from insolvency and disrupted supply chain. But I think the only way you can really understand the impact of both the productivity and the lack of resources is to take your current project and run a good old-fashioned resource balance to look at how that's actually going to affect things. I know it sounds strange in a conversation about project costs. It's not necessarily the money you need to worry about at this particular time.
Yeah.
It's more of a resources issue. You have to look at a resource balance. Do you need the same resources spread over different working patterns, or do you need a different mixture of resources? So, example, more mechanical handling, more mechanical plant, and a lower labor force, or greater offsite fabrication. And that's where you've got to do that resource balance, both across the cost of the resources and also the schedule impact of doing that.
So you're saying it's very much a bottom-up approach, and unless you've got those fundamentals of what resources you need in the manner in which you need them, you've got to work that up from the bottom. It's no good just starting at the top and saying we have to cut costs by X amount, because that doesn't really mean anything in this context, does it? You've got to come up from the bottom.
No, because if you're not going to change the scope, you're going to need the same amount of resources. But social distancing and the resource supply is going to cause that a problem, because it's going to change the amount of resources you need in terms of labor and plant and all that. You're still going to need the same quantity of materials unless you actually change the scope. What you need to look at is what's the impact of those changes in methodology. So once you've established that, you can then work out what the cost impact is going to be. It may even be cheaper to do it. But I wouldn't be as brave to suggest that at this time.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. And I think when we were talking about this in sort of discussion for this call, one of the really interesting areas that I thought you raised, and I wondered whether everybody's thinking about at the moment is data, you know, and indication of previous data that you've collected as being a reasonable basis to forecast future spend now. And I wondered, could you share your thoughts on that, because I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, the point that I was making about the uncertainty of data at the moment, and it's really the big issue, is that traditionally when you establish your cost budgets, you look at historical projects, historical cost trends and all that, and use that as the benchmark or the marker for your forward look on things. But if we change the methodology as to how we're going to work, those historic norms might not properly reflect the future. So it would be difficult to actually rely on that on the future. We have to look at the learning curves that we've established and the uncertainty which now exists in the methods that we do think and the resources that we have. It's about going back to first principles of establishing from your budget, from the work scope, what the actual impact is going to be. So, you know, with social distancing, as I said before, it's about looking at the resource analysis, but you've got to do it from a first principles basis. I suppose the other big issue you have with data uncertainty is what the economic impact is going to be. You know, we've looked at the amount of money which has been pushed in by most governments around the world into their economies. The governments are going to be looking at clawing that back somehow. So we're going to have taxation increases, I would guess, but also we're going to have change in the exchange rates between the various countries and a whole host of very different rates of inflation and deflation across different commodities. And therefore, we have to make sure that we've got our budgets or our cost baselines broken down into that basis so we can correctly model that as to what the effect may be. Because the problem with taxation is that it's quite often hidden within prices and not a direct thing that can be easily identified. So, you know, when you look at the problem, you can kind of summarize it in three big things. What the productivity is and how that's going to be impacted by social distancing, what the resources are you need for the project and how that's going to be affected by the change in the methodology and the way of working, and the disruption in the economy caused by both the change in the supply chain through possible levels of insolvency or supply problems to do with global movement of materials, and then also the changes in the economic conditions such as inflation or currency and taxation.
Okay.
So
well, yeah. In a minute, we'll talk about how do we even think about that? How do we go about managing it? But yeah. We also talked a bit about the culture, you know, and you know, and maybe if we have some time at the end of this call, you and I listened in on a very interesting webinar this morning, hosted by Mead in the Middle East, where clients are looking to renegotiate contract prices, and there was a fantastic question, you know, from one of the moderators on that panel saying, you know, do you all feel like everybody would say we're all in this together? You know, that we're all going to support each other and get through. And the response from both the lawyer represented and the head of the RICS there was, it's patchy, you know, which was a very diplomatic way of saying, you know, the usual power struggle that exists in these contractual deals that we have signed mean that the likelihood of true collaboration and true sitting around the table and really trying to work out something in the best interests of the project as a whole seems unfortunately not that likely. I don't know what you feel, but there are some great examples where I'm hearing where people really are doing that. So it's not everybody by all stretch.
No, I mean the success of how the industry tackles it will be down to the culture as to how we move forward. We've seen some things here in the UK with how we've actually tackled with COVID of great social learning between organizations. I've got a personal friend of mine who's one of the directors of McLaren, the Formula One race team, and the expertise which they've just basically given to other companies for free, just to help with the manufacture of these ventilators as to what they know. So the culture of the way how you tackle the problem would dictate the success of the industry to move forward.
Guys, that's a really good informative discussion about the situation we're in at the moment. And I just want to pick up on something that Karen just said, and let's kind of move our attention to, what kind of response, in order to mitigate, the possible effects of what's taking place. And I'm just looking at the three areas that we've discussed previously, which is this thing about data. You mentioned modeling and the methodology as well. So perhaps can we talk briefly about that for a few moments? Great.
I'm going to give that straight to you, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, because obviously in a situation, and Karen started this conversation by using the acronym VUCA. I've sort of distilled it down into things I know and things I don't know. I don't want to get involved in the Donald Rumsfeld riddle that he's always put forward about knowns and unknowns. But when you look at things like once you have the data, you have to undertake the correct analysis with that data to make sure it is. And when you've got a mixture of knowns and unknowns, you will never ever be able to work out a singular answer. So what you've got to then do is take that data and process it properly through a multivariate analysis, probability analysis, various CSRA, cost schedule risk analysis, and all that, to look at all the range of outcomes that you may actually possibly have. To say, because when you have an economic situation which is changing the way it is likely to change, you can look at supply from different sources of the world, different exchange rates and all that, and mitigate risk in that way. Things like social distancing, and that's where you need the input from the whole supply chain and the whole project team. Yes, you can do the same scope, but is there a better way of doing it? Can you change the engineering to reduce the amount of manual working which is take place, or possibly increase that fabrication? But you say there is no magical answer. You've got to run a whole different set of scenarios to see what might be occurring. And I say the variables are not just the money; it's in the resources and the methodologies that you have to do. And I suppose the starting point, if your project's undergoing at the moment, is making sure that when you start back the site into full operation, that there is sufficient time given to the project controls team to do the necessary re-baseline with the entire project team to get that very clear definition of as to exactly where you are on the project, and then what resources and strategies are needed to move forward. That's when you can then look at the different scenarios that you developed to fine-tune the models and to see which scenario may be the best way of moving forward.
And I think one of the key things there for me is making sure that if your construction site has been closed or partially closed, that you do some kind of health check or audit or whatever to work out exactly where you are when you're restarting. Because if you're restarting from the wrong assumption and basis, or you haven't been completely open and honest about your levels of progress, and you are showing maybe to a client that you are further ahead of schedule than you really are. I think
Yeah.
now is the time to put your cards on the table and say, look, this is where we are. We can put to one side, you know, any problems that we've had up to this date, but we've got to replan this based
Yeah.
on the reality of where we are right now. And we'll have to sort all of the other stuff out, you know, going forwards. But it feels like if you do, you know, an ostrich impression and pretend that you're somewhere where you are really not, and then try and replan going forwards, then you're going to get in a very big mess.
Yeah, and I would sort of add to that especially at a program or a corporate level, this is an excellent time to make sure that there is consistency between your processes and procedures, to make sure that all of your projects have followed those processes and procedures,
Yes.
and they are robust for going forward.
Yeah.
Because if you've got 6 different projects and they're all measuring things on a different basis using a different definitions, you really do not know where you are at a program level. So, you know, as it say, I absolutely agree with you. This is the time to put the sins on the table, but it's also a very good time to make sure that your underlying infrastructure within your company to move forward is as robust as it is going forward.
Yeah.
You know,
And I
taking
think, you
that
know,
time.
yeah, sorry, Chris. Yeah, it comes back to the VUCA situation. Is the companies that are really going to get through this and be successful are going to be the ones that can adapt and change quickly. And in order to do that, the senior management need to know that they're making decisions based on accurate information, as reasonably accurate as they can get it. Because if they're being told, you know, things which about their projects which people are either knowing not to be true or are not consistent across their projects, how can you make those decisions quickly and try and make the right ones? And I guess that comes down to sort of the scenario modeling that you were talking about, is not having just one plan and sticking to it like the Titanic going down. This is where, you know, complexity theory and really comes into its own in terms of the practice of modeling different scenarios, so that you've got the ability to quickly change track if you need.
Yeah, yes, and I would agree that you know, when it comes to dealing with the clients, the success that the contractor is going to have is to how well they've put their case forward, how well they've analyzed it and put forward that robust argument. It always goes back to the old thing that I was taught many years ago, is that when you go into negotiation, you've always got to know more than the other party, even if it's not your business. It kind of reminds me of a very major infrastructure project that I was involved in here in the UK, which had no baseline estimate because they didn't need one, because the contractors were going to tell them.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, you only have to read the newspaper presses over the
Yes.
last few months to know what happened on that major infrastructure project, because they didn't know. They just did not know what was going to be told. So this is a time of making sure that your data and analysis is as robust as possible. So when you go into those negotiations with both your supply chain and your client, if you're on the contractor side, that you're as knowledgeable as everybody else in that room.
Were you wanting to? I can't hear you, Carl.
That's because I haven't unmuted. I just wanted to interject, firstly, to say, Chris, I don't believe that was many, many years ago. You don't look that old. Secondly,
he is, believe me.
Secondly, just before we do the next poll, can we just spend a few moments perhaps talking about, you know, what about contracts that haven't yet started? You know, let's just consider those for a few minutes, and then I'm going to pop back in and move us along again, if that's okay. So contracts not yet started, where are we?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, Carl. I mean, I think I would encourage anybody who is in a position of a contract which hasn't started is to perhaps listen to the webinar which John and Karen did a couple of weeks back. Carl will tell everyone how to be able to watch
YouTube
that.
website. It's on our YouTube channel. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you watch that, and that's the starting point, is what's the actual current commercial position of the project, in terms of the starting point of what the contract says and how much are you committed. I suppose the three watch points that I would, or four maybe watch points I'd put out is, number one is, what does the contract conditions and the tender document say about possible future changes in legislation and government advisory notices? For example, social distancing, how is that dealt with? Two, I would be weary of any escalation mechanism, especially if it's tied to the consumer or retail indices. You only have to look at the current economic data to show that the retail price index is actually negative at the moment, and that is not necessarily appropriate for engineering construction. So if I was to look at any kind of escalation mechanism in any contract, I'd want that tied into the nature of work and the nature of resources that I have. And I would also want a serious discussion with the client over who is actually going to take the risk moving forward over changes in the economic situation. I suppose the third one I'd look at is what remedies are there in the contract if the resources cannot be secured. It's great to say, in a recession, you can always secure what you need, but that's not necessarily if there are major suppliers who are going under and not being able to supply. And you also have to look at things like, global travel. I was reading a thing on the BBC News this morning saying 80% of current flights are no longer flying. Well, that's a huge impact on just moving people around the world and getting them to the right position at the right time. So what's the remedy over that? And I suppose
Go on.
And I was just going to say that the fourth one, I suppose, Karen, is what we were talking about this morning, and that's, are you in a position to renegotiate your current position? And what does the commercial documents that you have in front of you on the future project say about the right from either party to renegotiate the commercial basis?
Yeah, I would, if you just got a moment, Carl, I can see you hovering there. The issue with that this period is potentially these couple of months for anybody who is about to sign a contract, and presumably it's been put on hold at the moment, is a massive opportunity to go over all of your execution plan and to challenge it, to challenge a bottom-up review of not only the project costs but everything else. This is your chance to speak up. You don't have to sign now, and much better to be putting that that hand up now and having that conversation in the best interests of the project, rather than just crossing fingers and hoping everything will be okay. It's not in your client's interest if you don't survive this the delivery of your project, or if your main suppliers and subcontractors don't do it. So use this time productively to really go through and have some real serious challenge, say on a bottom up. Take your estimate and challenge all the assumptions in it. The numbers are always very interesting in estimates, but what I'm always interested in is show me all the assumptions that underpin those numbers, and let's challenge those assumptions.
Yeah, I think the situation we have is that we're in at the moment is very different to anything I've ever seen before. We're talking about a global issue, a global problem. Normally when you talk about recessions or downturn, normally there's bright spots around the world, and you can move your resource supply and contract and all that around the world to help mitigate those subjects. But at the moment, that's not possible. So yes, it's my key message to everyone is back to basics. You know,
Mm-hmm.
do all
Yeah.
those good things you always wanted to say you would do, but you never really have the time. Make sure your schedule is resource loaded. Make sure the cost and the schedule are reconciled against one another. Make sure the estimate is reconciled against the scope. Make sure your entire project team fully understand the commercial conditions in which you're actually going to be in. Make sure you've got that procurement strategy very clearly worked out as to where all those supplies and resources are going to come from, and make sure you got the supply chain in place to be able to deliver it. But yeah, you know, step back for a week, have some think tanks, and really assess where you are and how you're going to move forward.
And so I was going to say, yeah, that this thing you mentioned about first principles, and the thing that Karen has also been kind of mentioning, that it seems that the first principles across all of the project, you know, really what are you implementing good practice, and if not, then now's a good time to check. But look, I just want to ask Wayne if he could bring up the second poll for us before we run out of time, and it feeds in quite nicely, I think, at what's been said here. So previously we asked, you know, what is likely to have the biggest impact on engineering construction costs? But now I want you to think about, you know, what are your biggest future challenges that, you know, you're facing in managing these costs? You know, is it through establishing the adequate cost and schedule baseline, establishing the methodology for the recovery of costs, understanding the impact of inflation and change in exchange rates, or the lack of skills within your team, for instance, to face those forthcoming challenges? And so just while we give you a moment to answer those, you know, this is really important when we do polls like this, because it gives us an understanding of what you're suffering. You know, we have a belief that we're there, but it really gives us cements that we're in the right place. And these webinars that we're doing, we intend to continue over on a 2 weekly basis, and we're using the findings from some of these polls here to guide us in where should we talk next, and how can we best help you and us all through this kind of weird, chaotic time. So maybe let's take a quick look at the results there. Okay. Do you know what? I'm going to just leave those standing for a minute. I'm going to let Karen and Chris talk around those, and as we move on to talking about profound long-term effects. So Wayne, just hold that there for a minute. Karen, Chris, back over to you.
Any surprises there, Chris?
Yeah, I suppose the one that surprised me is the top one about establishing an adequate cost and schedule baseline. Because theoretically, all you have to do at the moment is establish the baseline as to where you are at the moment, which should be, you know, following the standard methodology. I suppose that's quite surprising, because I would expect, you know, most people to be able to do that. So it'd be interesting to know what people perceive the problems are, and as to what might the problems in establishing the baseline. Is it the unknown of the actual time frame, or the unknown of the impact of some of the issues?
Yes, yeah. And I think this also comes back to you know, I mean, you and I have worked on a lot of big projects around the world, and the base, or the progress that we claim, where we really are compared to where we think we should be, there are often gaps there. And this kind of situation, when a construction site, for example, potentially comes to a complete halt, will expose exactly where you are. It's clear to see. So I think maybe there's some aspect of that, of people, you know, of artificially, I see so many monthly reports where people are artificially pushing in, you know, holding the end date and waiting, you know, things are coming along, and they're not allowing that end date to float to where it really should be, because, you know, then it triggers an uncomfortable discussion about who's responsible for that delay, and therefore who's responsible for the cost. So
Yeah.
and maybe there are also a lack of resources. You know, there are going to be a considerable number of people who are self-isolating at the moment, and if you've only got a couple of key estimators in your group, or key planners in your group, and they happen to be sick as well, then there's another aspect of this complexity. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose a lot of those issues come back to what we said earlier about the culture.
Mm,
You
hmm
know, you need an open culture on the project to begin with to
hmm
have that truth and reconciliation as to where
hmm
you really are on the project.
hmm
And
hmm
then you've got to have the open culture discussion with all of your suppliers and contractors
hmm
as
hmm
to where they think they are, what the issues are they see, and what they think the impact is going to be of the current situation,
hmm hmm
to be able to help you redraw that
hmm
baseline.
hmm hmm
Um, and I would also guess that there is probably some projects which have issues because a lot of estimates are based upon money only, not based upon
hmm
resources. We
They're
know
not
that the
resource loaded. Many projects are not, that I see schedules. If I'm doing a dispute or a claim and I ask for evidence of the resource loading that's underpinning the schedule, I would say 75% of people do not prepare resource loaded
yeah,
schedules.
yeah,
So they don't really know it, and we're asking people to go back to fundamentals of what resources do you need for this project. And if you haven't got a
yeah.
resource loaded schedule in the first place, you're going to struggle.
I'm well known for saying that the cost of any project is just the cost. The money situation is simply the common denominator.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
What the way how you do a proper estimate and a good sound estimate is you estimate all the resources first.
yeah, yeah.
The very last step you ever do is
Let's
then
convert it into money.
is then convert that into money, because money
Hmm
doesn't tell you anything. You need to know
hmm
the resources. You
hmm
need to know the time.
hmm
You need to make sure they're both aligned.
So, guys, my apologies for jumping in again. I'm just wary that we're running out of time, and you know how excited I get when we get questions at the end. And we have some questions which I'd like to put to you both.
Okay.
Let me go with the first one then, Chris. Let's direct it with you. Um, are there scenarios when you need to consider acceleration costs to recover time?
Yes. It depending upon the nature of the project.
I should have said,
Um,
what are they? Yes.
Well, it would depend upon,
Yeah. Okay.
what is the actual purpose? What's the end goal of the project? Does that project have to meet a particular deadline?
hmm
Or is it just supplying a demand in the market? You know,
Mhm.
um,
comes back to the discussion we had about mitigation versus acceleration in the last webinar as well, Carl, where
yeah,
everybody's got the obligation to mitigate, which is do the best you can to not make the situation worse, but you don't spend more money on it. If in the conversation that I hope you're all having with your client, you need to decide whether cost or schedule is the main driver for the client, and if the client wants to keep as close as possible to the schedule, then ask, as a client, ask for some options from your contractor on what their acceleration plans would be and how much it would cost. But beware of escalation plans that go from sort of this kind of thing to suddenly doing this, because it's impossible. So as a client there, you've got a challenge, and there's no point
mm,
paying for an acceleration plan that can't be delivered. You just lose your money twice.
Mhm.
So
yeah,
if I'm a client, I'm saying give me an option for it, but I'm really going to dig into and challenge your acceleration plan like crazy. So if you're a contractor, you need to get that prepared in a load of detail before anybody's going to pay you to accelerate.
yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
I just have another question here. Um, Sorry, I'm not saying, I would say who normally asks the question, but there's no name down here. And I'm going to do my best to read this one because I think it's been typed in haste. But it says, is my understanding that you consider that cost can be recovered, but that depends on each contract? Why are you assuming that cost can be recovered? So,
We're not. We're
okay.
not. If we go back to the previous webinars that we've done, it is very much up in the air as to whether you can recover costs. And if it's a pure force majeure scenario, then costs are not recoverable. So we were discussing there alternative like changes in the law, variation clauses, but actually the commercial reality is if you've both got a common interest to finish this project in a reasonable timescale to a reasonable budget, sit down together and have a commercial discussion,
Mm,
and that will involve an exchange of what I can give
yeah,
versus what you can give, and probably will require more money. So track the costs absolutely track them. Whether you'll be able to recover them, it really depends, and it really depends on the culture and the willingness of both parties to come to the table and talk.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's important. Going down the supply chain as well, you can't just accept a claim from a contractor or a subcontractor for costs.
No,
You need to challenge it and look at the legitimacy. And it kind of goes back to what I said about in any negotiation situation, you need to have as much knowledge or more knowledge than the other party sat across from the table. So work it out.
Great. Okay, thank you. We finished predictably just over time again. Thank
We're
you,
consistent
Karen.
with our lateness.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost if we plan it. Thanks again to Karen and Chris for indulging us for the last 45.5 minutes. And thank you all for joining us, wherever you might be. I hope you found this of interest. And if there are questions that you have which you weren't able to post here and you would like us to deal with, then either send it to myself or send it to Karen, and we will make sure that gets sent on to Chris, and we will give you those answers back to everybody that's joined in. If it's project specific, obviously, then we won't. This video should be up on our YouTube channel in the next few days. And as Chris said, you'll be able to find our other videos on there. If there are any topics you would like us to cover, we do already have some backed up that we've got planned, but if it's good, then we'll shoehorn it in, and I might even give you credit when we actually do that too. They're every 2 weeks, they're 45 minutes, so if you can join us, then that would be great. So I think that's probably about it. Thanks again for joining us. Stay safe, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.